Happy Sunday, everyone. Hope you're doing well as we head into August, which seems crazy. And for some strange reason, I have a desire to go find and eat a Choco Taco. Apparently these things have been canceled and I've never had one. So now I have to go find where remaining ones are being sold and hunt them down. Today's topic du jour, which I guess is redundant if you know your French, because I just said today's twice basically, but is religious liberty the right fight? Now, I've touched on this a little bit in the past, but I'm responding in large part, or reacting, I guess, to an address given just about a week ago by President Dallin H at the Notre Dame Religious Liberty Summit in Rome, Italy. So he was there representing the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. There were leaders of other faiths and denominations at this event. And so he was discussing, his title of his remarks was Pursuing Religious Liberty Worldwide. Now, this isn't a shocker at all, because for many leaders of the church, this mantra or idea or topic of religious liberty or religious freedom, which they use interchangeably, is one that we've heard a lot, especially President Oaks, whose background is as an attorney and former justice of the Utah Supreme Court. And so he is someone from a kind of constitutional and legal perspective has often commented about religious freedom, what it means and why it's important. But there were several parts of his address that kind of stood out to me with question marks. And for those of you who listened to the musing that I did, I think it was back in March, where I kind of touched on this topic, this won't be a shock to you that I think that the fight for religious freedom is myopic. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, negative sense. I mean that in the sense of, I think there's more to what we should be fighting for than religious liberty. And if we're always beating the religious liberty drum, I think we're missing an opportunity to educate our fellow saints and rally them towards a greater cause. And I'm going to touch on this in just a moment with a quote from Joseph Smith that President Oaks himself shared, but I think he missed one of the key portions of that quote in the, portion of the quote that he decided to share. I'll get to that in just a moment. So for me, religious liberty is important. People should have the right to believe what they want and act based on their faith, based on that belief. But the problem is when we constrain the conversation to religious freedom, we're necessarily excluding people who approach their beliefs or their actions from a non-religious standpoint, which encompasses a whole host of different actions. If I believe that entrepreneurship is a moral good and that it improves society, that is not a religious freedom. That is, me being able to have a lemonade stand for my kid on the side of the road without getting shut down, or it's opening a business or selling what I want to consenting, customers, selling as much as I want without arbitrary government caps restricting me. I think all those, restrictions or violations of this kind of right of free exchange and ability to buy and sell and so forth. I believe that entrepreneurship is critical, but it's not a religious belief. So are we saying that we're going to kind of abandon that fight or deprioritize it compared to religious liberty because, it's supposedly more fundamental? Well, that's what I want to quibble a little bit with, because I don't believe that it is religious liberty necessarily that is more fundamental. In fact, I think there are more fundamental things than that. And when we focus on the more fundamental things, which I'll mention here in a second, by focusing on the more fundamental things, we are encompassing and protecting religious freedom, but other freedoms as well. So rather than focusing on the outgrowth, the religious freedom aspect of it, we're focusing on the kind of foundational, fundamental virtues, doctrines, ideas, and then religious liberty as an outgrowth is protected. But so too might be entrepreneurship, as I just mentioned. For me, religious freedom really boils down to property rights. If we're concerned about churches having the right to build buildings and for congregations to worship together and for, being able to associate and deny association to someone or invite in whoever you want. Fundamentally, what we're talking about is not the right to worship or the right of free association or the right of, owning a building or determining who the members of your organization are. We're talking fundamentally about property rights. And so by focusing on property rights, by saying, well, of course, people have the right to associate with whoever they want, use their body in a certain way, invite them into their home, jointly, purchase property as part of an association or a church, determine the membership of that organization, the terms of admittance into the building, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Fundamentally, these are property rights. So this is kind of an example where I feel like to religious freedom, we say yes and, but the and is kind of going a level deeper and saying we should be talking about property rights. I'll mention more about this in a minute and why I'm so concerned about, when the church has been pushing religious freedom in the anti-discrimination realm, contrasting against so-called Lgbt rights and the purported kind of competing constitutional claims of religious freedom versus LGBT rights, and where do we compromise and what does that mean? Because I think that conversation often misses the mark. Now to the quote for Joseph Smith. This was shared towards the beginning of President Oaks's remarks. This is a quote you've all heard before, but unfortunately much of the quote is omitted when we, and President Oaks as well, share kind of the main portion. So this is 1843, Joseph Smith. He said, "I am bold to declare before heaven that I am ready to die in defending the rights of a Presbyterian, a Baptist, or a good man of any other denomination. For the same principle, which would trample upon the rights of the Latter-day Saints, would trample upon the rights of the Roman Catholics or any other denomination." Period. End quote. This is a quote perhaps you've heard before. It shows how kind of magnanimous or, big thinking or generous he was, Joseph, in his kind of view and trying to say he wasn't just looking to protect Latter-day Saints, he was caring about other people and recognizing that there are some of these universal principles that when defended, protected, are protecting not just us, but people of other denominations. You might also argue that, basically everyone was part of a denomination. And so by using the language and saying that it was about other denominations, he's really saying protecting everyone, including those of no faith, right? But I find very interesting a portion of what Joseph is saying that immediately follows that quote that I think relates very heavily to what President Oaks is talking about and what I'm reacting to today. So I'm going to recite kind of a portion of the quote again and then continue. He says, the same principle which would trample upon the rights of the Latter-day Saints would trample upon the rights of the Roman Catholics or any other denomination who may be unpopular and too weak to defend themselves. He continues, "It is a love of liberty which inspires my soul, civil and religious liberty, to the whole of the human race. Love of liberty was diffused into my soul by my grandfathers while they dandled me on their knees. And shall I want friends? No." And he kind of goes on to talk about one of the grand fundamental principles, he says, of Mormonism is to receive truth, let it come from where it may. He talks about how all of our religious views, he says, we could drink. He says that we could all drink into one principle of love. He's talking about kind of the focus of the gospel. But the key portion of this is, what is Joseph talking about when he's saying that he would be ready to die to defend the rights of any of these, Presbyterians, Catholics, whatever, Baptists, or a good man of any other denomination or women or no denomination? President Oaks and others who share this quote are tying it to religious liberty, because here Joseph is mentioning all these religions. But if you continue reading, Joseph himself expands the intent of what he's saying beyond just religious liberty. It is a love of liberty which inspires my soul, civil and religious liberty, to the whole of the human race. That's an amazing quote. Why aren't we sharing the full quote? This isn't just religious liberty, narrowly speaking. This is civil liberty as well. This is liberty generally speaking, of which religious liberty, so-called, is a subset. An important one, absolutely, right? But a subset nonetheless. So that to me is the big problem, where those of us who advocate for religious liberty are often doing so at the exclusion of other things. We're turning a blind eye to what I'll call civil liberties, because that's the terminology Joseph was using. right? We're turning a blind eye, we're excluding, it's not part of our focus, it's not part of our encouragement to other members of our church to stand up for these things. We're encouraging them to stand up for religious liberties, but we're not really articulating a concern so much for civil liberties. Now, what I found interesting is Elder Bednar, during 2020, there were two talks that he gave within like a few months of each other, where he was kind of sharing some messages where he was a little bit concerned about the encroachment upon the civil liberties by governments. I need to say that again. He was concerned about the encroachment of religious liberties by the government. And in one, the title was that the pandemic is a wake-up call, he said. A few months later, he was talking, the title of this one was Lack of Respect for Faith Leads to a Crisis of Legitimacy in the Government's COVID-19 Response. He was responding to churches being shut down and reflecting on, wow, like the government has assumed all these powers. This is really problematic. He's saying, I'm obviously paraphrasing, that the government should have limits, and this is problematic. Religious liberty is fundamental. It is very weak. It needs to be protected. He's also shared how religion is as important to people as physical health, that it is a component of life as well, and to suppress the need or to ban the kind of practice of one's religion while being myopically focused only on physical health was also problematic. So he had some interesting quotes in there where he's, albeit still focused on religious liberty, starting to say, whoa, the government response to COVID in the context of religious liberty was a problem. Here's this quote from the first address that he gave. He says, "Gathering is at the core of faith and religion. Indeed, if the faithful are not gathering, sooner or later they will begin to scatter. And because gathering lies at the very heart of religion, the right to gather lies at the very heart of religious freedom." So he's talking about how, God's commandment that we got to gather, and where two or three people are present, then so is the Lord. And this is kind of a fundamental practice of faith worship, is to do it with other people. It's not really something to do alone. It's meant to be done together. You've probably seen what I have, that throughout and since COVID and the government's response and the church's response to COVID, a lot of people have stopped coming back. They kind of got used to home church and then no church. They lost the practice of gathering and substitute it with other things or no things. And so they're not gathering once again. To Elder Bednar, as he says, the pandemic was a wake-up call. But again, the question is, should we be focusing just on religious liberty? The problem with doing so, with having this church-focused context when we're thinking about liberty, is that a lot of silly stuff happens. For example, in Poland, here's a news headline from Poland. Polish gym rebrands as church to stay open during COVID-19 rules. Atlantic Sports Fitness announced that it would start calling itself, quote, the Church of the Healthy Body, and call its trainers the Elders Council. The city is in the red zone, which requires gyms to close, but churches may open with social distancing. There have been other cases like this as well, but it's like, if we protect religious freedom, right, but not all these other freedoms, then all of a sudden people are packing into the religious context things that necessarily aren't. A gym calling itself a church just to have the civil liberty of opening and being able to offer their services to people, when only the religious liberty is what's getting protection. Yeah, we'll let the churches stay open because religion is important, but we're going to ban everything else. And then suddenly people are saying, well, I'm just going to call myself a church, right? It kind of dilutes what's going on, the power of the kind of religious side of things, if you're then focused on this like wiggle room and middle ground and trying to like evade these government bans by calling it a church. Then we have kind of the flip side of this coming from California, which won't be a shocker to anyone. Here's the headline. U.S. megachurches rebrand as strip clubs to dodge lockdown. 2 California megachurches have continued to defy the state's COVID ban on indoor worship services, rebranding themselves as strip clubs after their pastors took off a tie before their congregation. Strip clubs are currently allowed indoor patrons under California law. One pastor said his church is, quote, where we strip the devil of his hold, power, and authority over people's lives, end quote. So when we're focusing on a narrow subset of liberty and not liberty generally, when we're focusing on the outgrowth of these freedoms and not the foundational kind of property rights freedoms where we get to decide what we do with our body and with our property, then you get some of this silly stuff happening where, you know, people will call themselves a church or churches are punished versus other businesses, and the government is picking and winning losers. The real issue at play here with the COVID restrictions is that there were any of these lockdowns at all. Government should have informed the public and said, here's what's going on, right? You're all competent adults, act in your best interest, do what's right, let's be cautious, but let's not shut down society. But when the government steps into that and says, we are going to decide which types of businesses are okay and which are not, and then they're going to decide whether to ban churches, in some cases banning singing in churches because of the supposed, transmission of the disease, that's when you get a problem. To me, it invites a recognition of saying, wait a minute, when all this silly, funny business is happening, this kind of whack-a-mole of, religious freedom, civil freedom, government picking a winner here and a loser there, it's like that is all nonsensical. I think it invites us to reflect and step back and say, is there a more fundamental level where we can work to change things rather than having all these differences popping up? To me, that just makes a whole lot less sense. For example, the supposed religious right to use peyote in certain Native American religious circumstances, or in a more modern context, perhaps psilocybin or ayahuasca or some of these psychedelics that people are forming churches around and calling it part of their sacrament. There was a past court case dealing with peyote, and some of these people using psychedelics believe and claim, I think incorrectly, that court case, protects them, and that this principle of, religious freedom allows them to use their drugs that are on the controlled substance list and federally illegal, that they're allowed to use that for a religious context. We kind of elevate this religious practice and then sanctify it to protect it from the law. To which I say, but the real issue is that the government shouldn't be banning these things in the first place. If someone wants to do it for their mental health, but not in a religious context, why should they be denied that opportunity while we say the special religious people get to do it for their sacrament? All it really does is forces the mental health people who have more of a medical need into claiming that it is a religious sacrament, or, in an attempt, and I think often likely futile attempt, to be spared a government reprisal for what they're doing, when it's not really for them a religious thing. It's kind of corrupting religion in a sense to force these non-religious cases into religious claims just for protection from the state. And so I think that is a problem. So too with cake bakers making wedding cakes for gay weddings, if they believe for religious reasons or otherwise. It's their store, their ingredients, their time and energy. Why should they be forced to bake a cake for a gay wedding, whether it's a religious objection or not? Property rights solves this. It is their business. It is their right to decide. They don't need to give anyone a reason. Go to a different store. You're not entitled to the fruits of someone else's labors just because they are a so-called public accommodation. Just because they open that store door and offer their services to the public does not invite the government to ram down their throat all of these actions that might undermine or violate their beliefs, whether those are religious beliefs or not. Again, Joseph Smith talking about civil liberty and religious liberty. It's liberty generally that we should be fighting for, not myopically, I think, focused on religious liberty to the exclusion or to the forgetfulness or apathy or deprioritization of civil liberties. These are both important. President Oaks, when he started his remarks, he shares how he says, for me personally, religious liberty is not academic. In 1838, he says, my third great-grandmother Oaks and her family lost most of their property when the Missouri State Militia drove our members, then mockingly known as Mormons, out of that state. A few years later, Illinois state authorities stood by while a lawless element burned homes and drove church members from that state as well. In 1844, my wife's second great-grandfather, Hiram Smith, was murdered by a mob who opposed his religion. In 1893, he concludes, my great-grandfather Harris was sent to prison in the Utah Territory for his religious practices, and my great-aunt was the first woman in prison for hers. But these examples are really civil liberties, right? It is the government's enforcement of unjust laws and imprisonment and mob rule and, you know, the governor issuing an extermination order and all these things. Yes, religious liberty was an element because these people were believing things. These early Mormons, they were acting based on those beliefs. Later, it became about polygamy, which was the last couple examples that President Oaks mentioned. But before that, it was just people who happened to be religious that were being persecuted, primarily because of the concentration of their political power. All of these Mormons were moving in, you know, to these different locations where they were moving around. And the existing people who lived there were getting kind of freaked out. Are we going to have a Mormon sheriff and a Mormon judge right? Because these people from all throughout Europe are kind of descending into these concentrated areas, and they were seen as a political threat to kind of destabilize the status quo. And the existing people who lived there didn't really take kindly to that. Doesn't justify, again, what they did in response, some of them, but we can at least understand that this was a political thing. It wasn't necessarily or only, oh, let's attack them because they're a different religion. So yes, religious freedom was a part of it, no question. But it was also these civil liberties, these very examples that President Oaks is sharing at the outset of his remarks to support or promote this idea of fighting for religious liberty, were also basic civil liberty type things about unchecked government power, concentration of power, right? Abuse of power, all these things. Joseph Smith himself, in the quote that President Oaks shared, literally in the next paragraph, he just excludes that line that continues to say, you know, and again, I'll read it for those who came in late, it is a love of liberty which inspires my soul, civil and religious liberty to the whole human race. So I don't think that we can be so, again, myopic is the word that comes to mind. Use peyote if you want, use, you know, psychedelics if you want, whether it's because you've got anxiety or depression and it can help you in a medical context, or this is your religious sacrament in search of communion with the divine, right? The point is the civil liberties side, that the government should not be banning these activities, and we should not be carving out special exceptions just for religions. This is one of my chief complaints from years ago when the LDS Church negotiated the so-called kind of compromise between religious freedom and the quote-unquote LGBT rights in the context of housing. In other words, landlords having to rent to gay people if they didn't want to or whatever. And also employment, if a business owner wanted to fire someone because they were gay or trans or, you know, whatever. So this was like the big negotiation, and the church has come out and said, this is a great thing that we did, and they're trying to get Washington, D.C. to do it unsuccessfully. But the problem is that the church threw everyone else to the curb. They were focused on protecting, you know, at the time, the Scouts, BYU, the church. Let's make sure that religious organizations are exempt. They're basically fully exempt. So they get to hire and fire whoever they want. BYU can say, you know, you're gay or whatever. Like, we don't have to do this. They force everyone else to have to abide by this law. I believe it kicks in when you have either 15 units, like apartments in the housing context, or 15 employees in a company. So if you're smaller than that, then you're also exempt. If you're bigger than that, then the whole law applies to you, and you would be legally punished for any of this type of discrimination. But effectively, the church negotiates away everyone else's right of property to determine who they want to associate or not with, provided that they get their religious carve-out exemption for religious organizations, you know, churches, religiously owned companies, schools, and the like. And so that was my chief complaint, right? Is that we're ignoring the fundamental right here. It's property rights. It's right of association. I'm not going to go advocate that landlords or employers discriminate on the sole basis of the sexuality of their tenants or their employees. But I think they have that right. I think people have the right to be stupid. People have the right to act based on whatever their beliefs are. Maybe they have good reasons in their particular family business or in the location that their apartments are at, or I don't know. Maybe they have their reasons. So for the government to step in and say, nope, we're going to punish you if you use your property in a way that we don't like, but we're exempt from that because of religion. To me, that kind of cheapens things a bit to secure religious freedom to the detriment of the underlying freedom, property rights and freedom of association. When that debate in Utah was happening, Libertus was young. I didn't really have much political capital or anything, and I think we were only a few years old. So I was kind of writing some blog posts and maybe an op-ed about it and trying to raise our hand, say, guys, we got to be talking about the fundamental right. This is what matters. This is what, of course, no one cared, and they moved on and did their thing. But to me, that's the problem. That's what happens when we focus on religious freedom as kind of the sole focus of what's important. I mean, there are quotes in here, and President Oaks quotes lots of his fellow apostles talking about the importance of religious freedom and so forth. This is a consensus idea. And again, I don't think it's a bad idea. I think it's a fantastic idea. I just think it needs to be supplemented. Otherwise, it can be harmful. If we focus on religious freedom and then negotiate away everyone else's freedoms, I think we are in conflict with what Joseph Smith himself said, who was the introductory quote in President Oaks's remarks to begin with, right? Civil and religious liberty. So I would just like to see more acknowledgement of this broader issue, that even as the church focuses on religious liberty, which you might argue, well, it's a church. Why should it be focused on civil liberties? I might say, well, Joseph Smith was, and we should too. And, he was jailed all these times and the early saints were persecuted. The outward manifestation of our religious beliefs gets into the civil side. It gets into the government. I've shared on this, on my musings before, all kinds of stories. Here's one. I have, where did I put it? I put my book somewhere. I guess I put it out there. Here it is. In Christ versus Caesar, I quote from the Reynolds Supreme Court case. So this is dealing with polygamy. And the Congress, of course, you may recall that the Republican Party was founded for two reasons. It was to abolish what they called the twin relics of barbarism. The first was slavery. The second was polygamy. And so as they started winning seats in Congress and the political landscape started shifting, Congress was very hostile towards the Mormons because of polygamy. And so they passed the Moral Anti-Bigamy Act that was signed by Abraham Lincoln, which targeted the Mormon church, which I also kind of find funny because so many Mormons are Lincoln worshipers. And anyways, so that prohibited polygamy, limited church ownership of property. It was followed up by the Edmunds-Tucker Act, which disincorporated the church and dissolved church assets. I mean, they were going through a lot. So it was challenged in court, went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The case was Reynolds versus United States, 1879. And the black-robed attorneys on the court, the justices, which I think it's kind of weird to call them that, unanimously ruled against the church. And this is what they said, two short paragraphs. And this gets to the point about how our religious freedom, our religious beliefs, when we act based upon them, they have a civil implication. And so if we are just saying religious freedom, but we're not talking about the civil side, basically just basic freedom to do what we want for whatever reason, religious or otherwise, like Joseph Smith was saying, right? Then detrimental things can happen. So here's two paragraphs from the Reynolds v. United States 1879 case dealing with polygamy. Laws are made for the government of action, and while they cannot interfere with mere religious beliefs and opinions, they may with practices. Suppose one believed that human sacrifices were a necessary part of religious worship. Would it be seriously contended that the civil government under which he lived could not interfere to prevent a sacrifice? So here, as a law of the organization of society under the exclusive dominion of the United States, it is provided that plural marriages shall not be allowed. Can a man excuse his practices to the contrary because of his religious belief? Final sentence. To permit this would be to make the professed doctrines of religious belief superior to the law of the land. So the court unanimously is saying, look, we have these laws, and they can't interfere with religious belief and opinion. Believe whatever you want to believe, right? Believe in the flying spaghetti monster. Believe in nothing. Believe in, a pantheon of gods. Believe in one God. Believe whatever you want. The law isn't going to touch that. But the law can govern religious practices. And then, of course, they cite a ridiculous example, because, of course, the action of human sacrifice necessarily involves violating the civil liberties of the other individual. I don't think anyone here is talking about non-consensual behavior and protecting that, right? The religious right to, give children to Molech and sacrifice human. That's not what we're talking about here. That stuff clearly stands apart because it is violating the life, liberty, and property of that other person. But when we're talking about consensual acts, what we might call malum in se versus malum prohibitum, if you don't know the Latin, malum in se are actions that are bad in and of themselves, like killing someone else, theft, robbery, assault, murder, things like that, versus malum prohibitum, things that are bad merely because they're prohibited. They're not innately bad. They're not inherently evil, right? Typically, we call these victimless crimes. So it's the government's banning jaywalking, or selling lemonade without a permit, or things like this. No backyard chickens. These are mala prohibita, the plural of malum prohibitum. And so that's the problem here, is that the Supreme Court is saying, oh, we wouldn't want religious practices to be allowed that involve human sacrifice. Well, of course not. That's malum in se. It's inherently bad to kill someone else. But what about the government trying to ban malum prohibitum actions, consensual actions, polygamy? Of course, they thought back in the time that women were all being duped into this and brainwashed, and that it truly wasn't consensual. So that adds another wrinkle to it. But this last line is the kicker: to permit this, to allow people to act based on their religious beliefs without any government restrictions, right, would make the professed doctrines of religious beliefs superior to the law of the land. So that is the problem, that for those of us who are followers of the way, who are trying to be disciples of Christ, it's not just about religious belief, it is action. And those actions cannot be defined solely within the context of religious freedom, right? Because there are a whole host of things that the government does or that people do that we might think is wrong from a religious standpoint and that we might want to abstain from. Right? The Jehovah's Witnesses, I've shared before, for them, the flag worship is idolatry, pledging allegiance to the flag. And they've been punished for it like crazy in decades past, with cases that went all the way up to the Supreme Court and ruled against them. So it's not just about religious freedom to be able to worship together and sit in church and sing hymns and pay our tithing, right? It's about the outgrowth of our actions stemming from our religious beliefs. And here's the Supreme Court. President Oaks was a justice, here's all these justices unanimously a century and a half ago saying that government laws can regulate any action, whether religious or not, because to, allow otherwise would be problematic. Now, the last portion that I'll address here, or last part of my musing, would be in section 4 of President Oaks's talk. So section 1, it was his introduction. Then he talks about, in section 2, religious liberty facing serious challenges worldwide. And so he's talking about how, this is also interesting. Here's section 2. When he's talking about religious liberty, he says this: what are the religious freedoms or liberties that concern us? For faith communities, or churches, the United States Constitution guarantees freedom of association and the right to assemble, the right to determine new members, the right to select leaders and important employees, including in related organizations. He's talking about BYU, for example, and the right to function as an organization. So there he kind of talks about what religious freedom, why it's important for churches. Select your members, the right to assemble. For individual believers, for you and me, here's what President Oaks says why religious freedom is important. Essential rights include religious expression and exercise and freedom from religious discrimination. Now, I will acknowledge that he says includes, meaning there are other things. He says essential rights include, so he's not trying to define a full list, but the examples he shared really only deal with our core religious beliefs and the kind of actions that grow out from them. Being able to pay tithing, being able to go to church, being able to sing in church, being able to, serve other people, take them a casserole, I don't know. But that's kind of all he shares about why religious freedom matters for individual believers. Religious expression and exercise, so going to church, worshiping, going to your church meetings, and freedom from religious discrimination. He goes on later in the third section, in the background of religious liberty, to talk about past instances in which there was state-sponsored discrimination of religions. And then in his fourth section, he says that religious teachings and the religiously motivated actions of believers benefit society and deserve legal protection. That's good. I would just expand that, like Joseph, to say, we need civil protections too, not just for religious actions. He says that religions play a vital role in contributing to social stability. He then cites Clayton Christensen, who talked about how most Americans voluntarily choose to follow the law, not just because of its official enforcement, but that they believe that they are accountable to God. Now, this is interesting because elsewhere in his remarks, this is in section 5, he says that our responses to government laws and our relations with potential adversaries will be helped if we accept these two realities. Number one, that we are all fellow citizens who need each other. And two, that we are all subject to law. And so when he says, quoting Clayton Christensen, that most Americans voluntarily choose to follow the law, and when here he says that we are all subject to law, the question then is, what laws? He goes on to talk about how we should learn to live peacefully with some laws we dislike. That's a quote. Live peacefully with some laws we dislike. He says, even religious rights cannot be absolute. In a nation with citizens of many different religious beliefs or disbeliefs, the government must sometimes limit the rights of some to act upon their religious beliefs when doing so is necessary to protect the health, safety, and welfare of all. He's saying this seems to kind of address or rebut what Elder Bednar is saying about, whoa, government's going too far, right? This needs to be a warning, a wake-up call, he says, right? That church governments need limits. I mean, President Oaks would agree that governments need limits. But here, without any definition, President Oaks is saying governments must sometimes limit the rights of some to act upon their religious beliefs when doing so is necessary to protect the health, safety, and welfare of all. Of course, what's necessary is totally subjective. I mean, there have been all kinds of bureaucrats and nincompoops who have been claiming that all the shutdowns and lockdowns and bans and restrictions during COVID were necessary when, of course, they weren't. And so then when we're being encouraged to submit to the wise counsel of governmental leaders by our own church leaders, and these governmental leaders claim these things are necessary, then here's President Oaks saying that the government must limit the rights of some to act upon their religious beliefs when doing so is necessary. The problem is we're leaving the definition of necessary up to the government itself. So we're basically here with this quote giving them a green light to limit our rights. In addition, he says, some other citizens may even have competing constitutional rights against which some religious liberties must be balanced. This, I believe, is a call out to the church's efforts with LGBT accommodations, anti-discrimination, the housing and employment law I mentioned earlier, where these supposed constitutional rights to not be discriminated against, to rent someone else's apartment or to get a job in someone else's company, that's been turned into claims of a constitutional right to a job or to housing. And so he's saying some religious liberties must be balanced. I would quibble with that because I don't think, again, if we're focusing on the fundamental rights, the right to property, the right to free association, being able to do with your home, your business, your body, what you please, no one forcing you to do things you want. Again, not just the religious liberty, but the civil liberty. If we're focused on those fundamental freedoms, I don't think other people have competing constitutional claims to my body. or to my home. They are not entitled to rent a room in my basement. If it's my building and it has 20 rooms and I rent those out as apartments, no one else has a constitutional right to live there. It is my home. I built it on property that I legally acquired. I get the right to determine who comes in. I can be a jerk and discriminate. That's my right. And if others don't like that, they're welcome to boycott me or to protest in the street or to leave a nasty Yelp review or to do whatever they want in a marketplace of ideas, but they don't have a constitutional right to my property. That is why we have to bring this down to a fundamental level. Otherwise, we get into these claims that there are competing constitutional rights against which some religious liberties must be balanced, or that the government, quote unquote, must sometimes limit the rights of some to act upon their religious beliefs. That, I believe, is the danger of focusing on these kind of these outgrowth things like religious liberty, right? I don't think it's LGBT liberty, or I don't think there's LGBT rights or black rights or minority rights or Mormon rights, or there's just rights. There's not different rights because of this color of your skin or who you are intimate with or your ethnic heritage or where you live or what you believe. We just have these basic fundamental rights, all people. And so this to me is a challenge here to say that we have these competing constitutional rights and we should balance ours. He says, our efforts to resolve challenges to religious liberty will be strengthened if we do not always seek total dominance for our own positions. Some accommodations may be necessary as we strive to honor legitimate laws and respect other persons' highest ideals and human experiences. Well, what is a legitimate law? From President Oaks' vantage point, based on everything I've read that he said, I believe what he's saying is not laws that are legitimate because they're founded on true principles. He's referring to laws that are created following the true political, the established political process. A legitimate law from his vantage point, again, based on my reading of all the stuff that he says along these legal constitutional lines, is that if a group of politicians get together who exist because they won a popularity contest, and they get together and a majority of them vote and say, we think there's a constitutional right to housing and to employment, then that would be considered a quote unquote legitimate law in President Oaks' vantage point. And here he's saying that we should make accommodations as we strive to honor those so-called legitimate laws and respect other people's highest ideals and human experiences. To me, this is a bit of a deviation from, again, focusing on the fundamental rights that apply to everyone equally, that everyone has access to as being a human, that everyone is entitled to, regardless of your size, shape, color, creed, whatever. Let's focus on what unites us and not the competing constitutional claims and the contrasted human experiences and other people's highest ideals. I should not have to subordinate my individual rights to someone else's highest ideal. I don't know what that means. Or their human experience. I don't know what that means. Again, in this context, talking about religion versus LGBT rights, which is where the church's battle has often been fought, gay LGBTQIA plus triple cubed, whatever that term now is, people who are in that camp have a human experience that is often very challenging, very stressful. It's not to diminish the fact that we all have challenges and different things going on in life that make it hard. They have challenges too, like we all do. So they have a human experience. Maybe they have a hard time in their city where they live finding a landlord who will rent them an apartment or an employer who will give them a job. So that's their human experience. That doesn't mean, I believe, that we should have the government step in and suppress and violate the fundamental rights of other people just because of a high ideal or a human experience. He says, in every country, religious leaders can play an important role in discouraging the use of state power to cause or support religious persecution. And this is good because certainly the state should not favor one religion or another, should not, as happened to the Mormons, dispossess the church of its belongings and incarcerate people for living polygamous marriages. So absolutely we should discourage the use of state power to cause or support not just religious persecution, as he says, but any abuse of authority, right? I believe, for example, I shared earlier that I believe entrepreneurship is a moral act that betters our society, but that's not a religious belief. I think that we should also discourage the use of state power to undermine entrepreneurship, overregulation, banning certain businesses altogether. Like, that's important for human betterment and human flourishing and, the well-being of our brothers and sisters. But that's not a religious thing. And so why focus just on religious persecution? I believe that a business should be able to refuse service to anyone for any reason. That's not necessarily a religious view. It's a property rights and free association view. I believe that taxation is theft. That's not a religious belief, right? But maybe I or others who share that belief will act based on that belief. I don't believe that the protection of our actions should be relegated only to if they are religious beliefs. I believe that people should be able to engage in a profession of their choice without getting a permission slip from the government, now known as occupational licensure. Like, a third of the workforce has to go to the state and jump through its hoops in order to get their permission slip to work. I believe that's wrong. That's not a religious view, but I believe that I should and others should discourage the use of state power, right, to suppress people's rights more broadly, not just their religious activity narrowly. All right, and then, I'll end there. There's just a lot more. I've kind of highlighted all kinds of parts of the talk. There's good stuff in here, and I don't want to diminish the importance of fighting for religious liberty. That is very important. But what I've seen over the years of the church's public advocacy for religious freedom is nary a mention of civil liberties. We just went through a period when civil liberties were brutally suppressed. Religious liberties too, in a lot of cases. But civil liberties especially. And where was the church? Where were we as church members? Where was the spotlight on the civil liberties side? The aggressive government power and growth, invasiveness, and bossing people around, shutting down businesses, affecting commerce. I mean, in Utah at one point, several counties started banning gatherings of 10 or more. And then we kind of blew sounded off a warning that it's like, you do know there are families in Utah with more than 10 people, and the way these laws were hastily written, because everything was being done hastily, it had no exception for families. I mean, not just normal families, polygamous families too. Family reunions, right? There were people who were like, oh, we can't have grandma and grandpa over, I guess, because we've got, 9 people in our family, and that would make 11. And so then the governor came in and shot those county ordinances down, and we moved on. But the point is that it's about more than religious freedom. Gosh, I love this quote by Joseph Smith. I'm glad that President Oak shared it. I wish he would have shared the following line, right? I'm just as ready to die in defending the rights of basically any person, he says. For the same principle which would trample upon the rights of the Latter-day Saints would trample upon the rights of anyone else who might be unpopular and too weak to defend themselves. It is a love of liberty which inspires my soul, civil and religious liberty to the whole of the human race. I love that quote. That to me strikes at the heart of what we should be focused on. Yes, religious liberty and civil liberty. Not just the right to worship in our buildings and forget about everyone else. Not the right to have BYU hire whoever they want and force everyone else to surrender their right of free association and property rights. Not just religious freedom to congregate in a church, but also to congregate in a concert hall, right? Or in a stadium, or in the office. Liberty more broadly is worth protecting. There's so many religious reasons to do so. I wrote about it in Latter-day Liberty, my first book. I wrote about it in Christ versus Caesar, my more recent book. Like, our religious beliefs inform our actions, and we can't just sit around believing things. Yay, we have religious freedom. I can go sit in a chapel and then go home and have all this tyranny everywhere else. But I can go to church and worship, so everything is all right. And I don't believe that's what the church leaders believe. My worry is that by beating this drum, I'm standing here next to our family's piano, right? If you hit that same note on the piano over and over and over again, right? You forget to understand or recall what beautiful chords can sound like when the notes are played in concert with others. We shouldn't hit this note without hitting the other ones as well. And I don't know that it's the leadership of the church's role to sound the drum for civil liberties. I kind of think, at least in part, because Joseph Smith himself was doing it, so why not them? But I do think that it is our responsibility. And the challenge that I've stated many times before in these musings is that the culture of our church is so messed up that most people only do what they hear the church leaders say to them. And there's very little of independent seeking, searching, study that would lead people to these different actions. Because if it were important, the brethren would tell us. And we become slothful servants waiting to be commanded, to be told in all things, rather than being anxiously engaged in a good cause and, like Joseph Smith, being willing to die to defend the rights of anyone else, because a love of liberty inspires our souls, civil and religious liberty to the whole of the human race. That to me is what's important. That to me focuses on the fundamental rights. Whether you arrive at these for religious or non-religious reasons, whether it's about bettering other people's lives in an economic context or a political context or a theological context, right? As Joseph Smith himself went on to say in that same quote, it's all about love. And as I write in Christ versus Caesar, the state is the antithesis of love. It is the institutionalization of hate and envy and greed. We can't love one another through the state. And so if we just focus on religious liberty and then take our ball and go home, we're tolerating, we're consenting to, we're being apathetic towards the attacks on civil liberties. If we love people, then we have to defend them, not just in their religious freedoms, but their other freedoms as well. I believe that's a fundamental principle of Mormonism, to use a quote from Joseph right here. One of the grand fundamental principles of Mormonism is to receive truth, let it come from whence it may. Not just religious truth, civic truth, economic truth, and all the rest, circumscribed into one great whole. So yes to religious liberty and civil liberty. The right fight is not narrowly just on religious freedom. I think it's on more fundamental freedoms that have a religious context, a civil context, and others. Have a good week.